What's up, everyone? I'm your host, Brian, and I'm here today channeling my best Magnus Walker impression. I've even got the shoes. But I'm not here to talk to you about the air-cooled 911s of his generation, but the water-cooled 911s of mine. Specifically, I'm here to talk about the Porsche 996. And the Porsche 996 these days probably has a reputation as the least loved or the most hated 911, but that wasn't always the case. In fact, when these cars first came out, and this might be a little bit of revisionist history on my part, because I admittedly haven't looked it up, but I think history tends to be better when it's spoken word from memory. This car saved Porsche. Porsche was struggling financially, they weren't doing significant volume, and they took one major shot on goal, moving to water-cooled engines and mass production. This car has an interesting history. I remember when it first came out in Boxster form that these were everywhere. For as hated as this car has become, it saved Porsche. Much like the car itself, the exact details of this car don't so much matter anymore the way they did when these cars were new. For example, I have no idea exactly how much power it has. I think it's got roughly 320. As a buyer at this point in the life cycle of this car, I can tell you it is enough. I've owned multiple iterations of this car, and a younger me had wished that this car was faster. I had a 996 C2 narrow body. I got an amazing deal on it at the time, and I loved that car to death. I enjoyed the crap out of it, and I sold it for pretty much what I paid for it, which is one of the most impressive things about the Porsche 911 and is what draws in a lot of buyers, which is they're generally very affordable after they've depreciated. They hold their value incredibly well. They're a hoot to drive, and so you can enjoy them for years and not feel so bad about how it hurts your pocketbook. When I purchased my first 996, I went into it eyes wide open. I had already known about the IMS bearing issues, and I was concerned about it, but I viewed it as an opportunity to get a car that ought to be worth $50,000 for mid-20s. Being an engineer by trade, I knew and understood the true problem with the engine, and it's actually that there is a sealed bearing on one side of the intermediate main shaft, IMS, that is sealed when it should be submerged in oil. And a sealed bearing has a mean time to failure, and I think most people concluded it's in the 90,000 mile range. So to me, this is a ticking time bomb type of issue, and replacing the bearing with the LN Engineering Solution bearing, potentially considering it a regular maintenance item, were options, but I really wanted a permanent fix. And so for my first car, I went above and beyond to do the LN Engineering IMS Solution, which replaces the bearing, the ball bearing, with a plain bearing. It's basically a giant chunk of metal and a high pressure oil feed that's siphoned from the oil filter to make sure that this bearing would never fail in the engine. And shout out to my favorite Bay Area German car mechanic, William, at Bay Area Motor Works. He studied under the person who developed the LN Engineering IMS Solution, and he was the first one in the Bay Area to install that on a car, as far as I know, and it was my car because we undertook the project together. Now, for this car, I didn't go to that extent. And I'll explain this purchase, but basically this car had just had the Ellen Engineering IMS bearing replaced 2 months before I bought it, and that was sufficient to me to be able to get continued use out of it from this point. I've owned multiple generations of this car. The first 996 I sold to upgrade to a 997, and I did that because I wanted to be able to drink my coffee while driving a sports car, and I thought the dual clutch PDK transmission was going to give me the best of both worlds in terms of performance and letting me cruise and commute without having to shift all the time. I actually did buy a 997, and for whatever reason, it didn't live up to the enjoyment that I had in the 996. It was a much better built car. The fit and finish, the materials, everything was raised up a level. The PDK transmission wasn't all that I had hoped it would be. So when I fell out of love with the 997 and decided to move on and sell it, I purchased a McLaren 12C as the upgrade. And that is an incredible car in its own right. We still have it. It is one of the few that has a spot in our garage indefinitely. But it isn't a replacement for a 911, and certainly not a 996. So we live in sunny California, and my wife and I love the weather here. We love top down in a sports car headed to wine country, and we miss that feeling, and you definitely don't get it in the McLaren 12C. So she actually told me she wanted a 911 convertible again. And I was faced with an interesting dilemma, which is, which generation do I buy? And the funny thing is, having owned both a 996 and a 997, I gravitated towards the 996. And it can't be explained objectively. The 997 is a better built, more polished, more powerful car. I'm sure certainly the PDK versus the stick had something to do with it, but the 996 has a very analog feel. And this is where we get into why the 996 is so great. The 996 comes after the air-cooled 993s. It really has a old school, classic, feel the road through the steering, great sounds, just great feeling vibe to it, without that kind of sanitary, spick and span, well-polished feel of the 997. It's kind of like you have an old school leather jacket that's well worn in, that you take everywhere, and the scratches and scars you've gotten on it over time actually give it character and make it more unique and thus more valuable to you. That's the way I feel about the 996. And this car in particular, really, when I saw it listed for sale, hit me right in the feels, because it took me back to 2006 when I was on Pacific Coast Highway with my wife in a 1995 Nissan Maxima. We didn't have any money to our name, and I looked out the passenger side window, and a 996 C4S Cabriolet pulled up next to us in Atlas Gray. And I know it was Atlas gray because I remember looking over and thinking, that color is amazing. It's blue, it's gray, it changes with the way the sunlight hits it. And when that car took off, the sounds it made with the sports exhaust were just glorious to me. And I just remember thinking, that is a very good looking, great sounding, awesome car. And not only that, I remember it had these hard shell seat backs that were painted the body color of the car. When I saw this car behind me listed on Craigslist, I remember thinking to myself, that is the exact spec that I saw out the window of my car on PCH back in 2006. And for all I know, given how rare the hard shell seatbacks are on the 996 generation and how rare the Atlas gray color is, and the fact that this is in the same area, this may very well have been that same car. In terms of purchasing criteria, I knew I wanted a driver's car. This one in particular had about 100,000 miles on it. It is a driver's car, but it's also a very good condition car. It's been well maintained. The paint looks fantastic. There certainly are its battle scars, but overall, it's in great shape. And the amazing thing about this car, I always hunt for a good deal. I was able to get this one for $27,500, and this was in February of 2021. I both got lucky with the timing of the overall car market and lucky with the price of this car itself. That is an absolutely fantastic deal for what I've gotten here. And really, it speaks to 996s in general. These cars drive amazing. The 4S, having the four-wheel drive, certainly is a little bit heavier in the front, but not obnoxiously so. The 996 C2, I remember it just was so intuitive and instinctive on a back road. It didn't have too much power to really get you in trouble, but you could feel everything the car was doing. You could drive the snot out of it, and it was just so enjoyable. And that's what brought me back to this generation and this car behind me, aside from the fact that I also think it is a beautiful looking car. For those who want to get out and drive, to me the 996 strikes the sweet spot of all the 911 generations. It is very close to as analog as the air-cooled, as close as you can be without being air-cooled, but far more reliable and affordable and cheaper to own and maintain. On the flip side, they're a lot cheaper as a result of the reputation that's been built on these cars and the departure from the classic styling. So you find these for quite a significant discount versus 997s and newer, although 996 prices certainly are climbing these days very significantly because I think people have kind of found this hidden gem. And as styling goes, I actually don't think the 996 is ugly. I think that Porsche modernized the design when it went from the 993 to the 996, and then it decided to go more classic again, to round off the headlights, to kind of square off the car more versus keeping it so sleek. But I think that if you were to actually put this in a lineup, not so much from the materials, because the materials were from the era, so you've got smaller wheels as an example, but if you just look at the profile and style and design of the car, I think it's one of the most modern looking 911s even to this day. So I'm not going to say that this car is my all-time favorite 911, period. I actually do tend to gravitate towards and like the classics a bit more. At the moment, I think my favorite is the 964, although at one point in time it was the 993, and at another point it was the 997. I think there are aspects of all of these cars that I like. In particular, as it relates to the 996 and the C4S behind me, I think the rear 3/4 view is probably one of the best out of all the 911 generations, period. And that about does it for this video. If you made it this far, I appreciate you watching. I hope you enjoyed it. If you liked it, please hit the like button. It really helps the algorithm. If you're interested in more of this content, please subscribe. Every little bit helps, and I will see you at the next one.